Story 1. I don't know what I saw in Nevada. We just wanted a quiet trip to Nevada, a chance to escape the noise of the city and see the mountains up close. I never expected that drive up Mount Rose to leave me with a memory I can't explain and a fear I can't shake. My husband Tom and I decided to take a road trip out west to Nevada. We had been feeling burnt out by work and city life, and the promise of open skies and mountain views sounded like the perfect remedy. Neither of us had seen the mountains up close before, and I'd always wanted to witness their grandeur firsthand. After some research and a recommendation from a colleague, we settled on staying in a small town near Reno. The town wasn't much more than a cluster of motels, diners, and a gas station, but it was right at the base of Mount Rose. The view alone was worth the trip. We checked into a modest but clean motel that had a stunning view of the mountain range. It was one of those places where the charm was in the simplicity. No frills, just a cozy bed, hot showers, and a window that opened to a breathtaking panorama of snow-capped peaks. We were both eager to explore. I spent the first evening sitting by the window, watching the sunset paint the mountains with hues of pink, purple, and orange. The air was crisp and cool, and the sky was so clear that you could see countless stars beginning to blink into existence. The next morning, we woke up early, grabbed some coffee and breakfast from a nearby diner, and decided to head up Mount Rose. We'd heard that the views were spectacular, and we were excited to see them for ourselves. The drive up was winding and steep, the road narrow and flanked by towering pine trees. There was something serene yet eerie about the forest. It felt ancient, like it held secrets it wasn't ready to share. About halfway up, we noticed that the snow was getting thicker. Despite it being late spring, the higher elevations were still covered in a thick white blanket. The road to the summit was closed due to the snow, but we were allowed to drive up to about 9,000 feet. From there, we could see the world stretched out below us, a sea of white clouds nestled between mountain peaks. It was like standing on the edge of a different world. We parked the car in a small lot near a viewpoint and stepped out. The cold air hit us immediately, but our insulated jackets and boots kept us warm. Tom was eager to snap some photos, and I was content to just take in the view. The wind howled softly through the sparse trees, and the snow crunched beneath our boots as we walked around the area. After a while, Tom wandered off to explore the rocks and trees a bit more. I stayed by the car, breathing in the fresh mountain air. The world was quiet, save for the occasional whistle of the wind and the faint rustling of pine needles. There were no other people around, just the two of us and the mountain. As I stood there, soaking in the stillness, I suddenly heard something, a faint, almost imperceptible crunching sound. It was rhythmic, like footsteps in the snow. At first I thought Tom had circled back around, but when I turned to look, he was still off in the distance, his back to me as he inspected a cluster of rocks. The sound was coming from the opposite direction. I frowned and took a few cautious steps toward the noise. My heart began to beat faster, though I couldn't say why. The snow was pristine, untouched. But there, just beyond a small cluster of trees, were faint tracks. They were small, almost delicate, like the paw prints of a wolf or a large dog. The thought of seeing a wolf up close sent a thrill through me, and I carefully followed the tracks, my boots sinking slightly into the soft snow. The tracks led me deeper into the sparse forest, where the trees grew more closely together. The wind had picked up slightly, sending flurries of snow swirling through the air. The sound of my own footsteps was muffled by the wind, but that other sound, the faint crunching, was still there. It seemed closer now. I paused near a particularly gnarled pine tree, my breath visible in the cold air. The tracks ended abruptly at the base of the tree. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. How could the tracks just stop? It was like whatever made them had vanished into thin air. I took another step forward, craning my neck to peer around the tree. And then I saw it. A pale figure, almost blending completely with the snow, scurried away from the tree. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. It moved on all fours, its limbs impossibly long and thin. Its body was emaciated, almost skeletal, and its head was disproportionately large. The head shape reminded me of those stereotypical depictions of aliens: bulbous, smooth, devoid of hair. The figure's skin was a sickly white, almost translucent, and it seemed to shimmer slightly, as though it was only partially there. It paused, turning its head to look at me. Its eyes were small, black, and unsettlingly wide apart, set almost on the sides of its head. There was no nose, no mouth, just those black pits that seemed to suck in all the light around them. I was frozen in place, a chill running through my entire body that had nothing to do with the cold air. The creature's hands were half buried in the snow, but as it shifted to move, I saw them clearly. Long, wiry fingers that looked more like claws than human digits. It stared at me for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only a second or two. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, it leapt forward. It covered an impossible distance in a single jump, landing silently in the snow before vanishing once again into the whiteness. The way it disappeared made it look as though it was blending into the snow itself, like a chameleon fading into its environment. I finally regained control of my body and stumbled backward, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I turned and ran back toward the car, my breath coming in ragged gasps. When I reached the vehicle, Tom was already there, fiddling with his camera. He looked up, surprised by my expression. "What's wrong?" he asked, concern creeping into his voice. I saw something," I managed to say, my voice shaking. "Something out there in the snow." He frowned, glancing over my shoulder toward the trees. "A wolf?" "No," I said, shaking my head. "It wasn't a wolf. It was... I don't know what it was." Tom didn't believe me. He thought I was just spooked by the isolation and the cold. But I knew what I had seen. That pale figure, those black eyes, they were burned into my mind. Even now, years later, I still see it in my dreams. And every time winter comes, when the snow blankets the ground and the world turns white, I feel a chill that has nothing to do with the weather. It's the memory of that thing, watching me from the snow, blending into the whiteness, waiting. For what? I still don't know. Story 2. The Thing in the Woods. We thought it would be a fun night under the stars, just a bunch of high school friends on a trampoline, but the woods behind my friend's house had other plans. Plans I still wish I could forget. Nights where you feel like nothing can go wrong. My friend Matt's parents were out of town for the weekend, so we decided to have a sleepover at his place. There were 4 of us: me, Matt, Jason, and Tony. We had plans to stay up all night, watch stupid movies, and laugh until our sides hurt. Matt's house was on the edge of town in Cedar Creek, Texas, right next to a small patch of woods. It wasn't a dense forest, more like a narrow strip of trees that stretched a few miles behind the neighborhood. There were no fences to separate the backyard from the trees, just an invisible line where civilization ended and the wild began. That night, we got the idea to sleep outside on Matt's trampoline. The air was warm and the sky was so clear you could see every star. It seemed like the perfect plan. Lying there, watching the night sky, telling stories and messing around. But Matt was hesitant. He mentioned that sometimes homeless people wandered through the woods and occasionally deer would stumble into the yard. We laughed it off, thinking he was just being paranoid. I wish I'd listened to him. We dragged out pillows, blankets, and a couple of sodas. After setting up, we sprawled out on the trampoline and started goofing off. Jason was showing us dumb memes on his phone, Tony was making jokes, and Matt was trying to relax despite his unease. The night felt perfect. About an hour later, as we lay there in a comfortable silence, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of twigs snapping and leaves crunching. It was faint at first, almost blending with the usual noises of the night. but it was rhythmic, deliberate. Someone, or something, was walking through the woods. I turned my head and saw Matt sitting on a pool, floaty that he'd dragged out onto the deck earlier. His eyes were fixed on the tree line. His face was pale, and he whispered, "I told you this was a bad idea." We all froze. The crunching sound grew louder, closer. I scanned the darkness, trying to see what was out there. The air felt suddenly colder, and the night seemed too quiet. Even the crickets had stopped chirping. Then the sound stopped completely. Silence pressed down on us like a weight. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the nerves. Maybe it was just a deer or a raccoon. I glanced back at my phone, trying to act like nothing was wrong. That's when I saw it. From the corner of my eye, a tall, thin figure emerged from the darkness. It moved quickly, silently, darting from the woods into the backyard. It was just a shadow at first, a silhouette, dark against the faint moonlight. But the shape of it was wrong. It was too tall, at least 7 or 8 feet, and painfully thin. It was human-like, but not human. The limbs were too long, the joints too sharp. We all saw it, and we all did the same thing, screamed and bolted off the trampoline. Matt, despite a leg injury from a few months back, was the first to make it to the sliding glass door. I don't know how he ran so fast, but adrenaline does strange things. Jason and Tony were right behind him. I tripped over a blanket in my panic, but somehow managed to scramble to my feet and dive inside the house. We slammed the door shut and locked it. Our breaths came in ragged gasps, and we clutched at each other, trying to process what we'd just seen. The living room lights were off, and the only illumination came from the faint glow of streetlights outside. For a few minutes, none of us spoke. We just listened, our ears straining for any sound. My heart was beating so loudly I thought it might burst. Finally, Jason whispered, "Did anyone else hear it run?" We all shook our heads. That was the worst part. Whatever it was, it made no sound. No footsteps, no rustling, just that horrifying, silent glide across the yard. After what felt like an eternity, Matt peeked through the blinds. The yard was empty. The trampoline sat there, still covered with our abandoned pillows and blankets. Nothing moved. The woods were dark, inscrutable, hiding whatever horror lurked within them. We stayed up all night, too afraid to sleep. Every noise outside made us jump. Shadows seemed to creep closer to the windows, and every gust of wind against the house sent a spike of fear through my chest. At sunrise, we finally dared to go outside. The yard was exactly as we'd left it, except for one thing. In the dew-covered grass, we saw a set of tracks leading from the woods to the house. They weren't human tracks. They weren't animal tracks. They were long, narrow impressions, almost like elongated feet with sharp points where toes should have been. We never talked about that night with anyone else. Who would believe us? But we all knew what we saw. Something unnatural, something that didn't belong in our world, came out of those woods that night, and it was watching us. Even now, when I visit Matt's house, I can't look at those woods without feeling a chill run down my spine. Whatever it was, it's still out there. And I have a terrible feeling it's waiting for another chance to come out of the dark. Story 3. My encounter on Blackwell Bridge. We thought it was just another spooky urban legend, a haunted bridge in the middle of nowhere. But that night on Blackwell Bridge, we realized some stories are far more real than we ever imagined. Late-night adventures. We both loved chasing urban legends and ghost stories, visiting supposed haunted locations for the thrill of it. Most times, nothing happened, just a creepy vibe and a few laughs. But that night on Blackwell Bridge in Hartsville, Indiana, was different. It was a night I still can't shake. Blackwell Bridge had a reputation. The story went that in the late 1800s, the landowner who oversaw the local mines would punish his workers by taking them to the bridge, slit their throats, and dump their bodies in the river below. Then, in the 1960s, after the bridge and the nearby house were renovated, a man went mad, killed his entire family, buried them under the porch, and hanged himself on the bridge. We'd heard these tales before, but there was something about Blackwell Bridge that sent shivers down my spine even before we got there. Maybe it was the remoteness, the way the road seemed to vanish into darkness as you approached. Or maybe it was the countless reports of ghostly figures and strange sounds people had shared online. Whatever it was, we couldn't resist seeing it for ourselves. We decided to head out around midnight. The night was sweltering, the kind of humid Indiana summer night where the air feels heavy and thick. We rolled the windows down in Alex's old black sedan, hoping the breeze would give us some relief. But as we turned onto Blackwell Road, the air grew strangely cold. The sudden chill made me shiver, and I could see Alex's breath in the faint glow of the dashboard lights. We drove slowly, the headlights cutting through the thick darkness. The road wound through dense woods, the trees closing in on us like they were trying to keep us out. The bridge was deep in the forest, far from any houses or streetlights. When we finally reached it, the silence was suffocating. Blackwell Bridge was an old one-lane iron bridge, rusted and weather-worn. It creaked softly as we drove across, the sound echoing into the night. We parked the car on the far side and got out. The river below was calm, its surface reflecting the faint light of the moon. I felt a strange heaviness in the air, like the bridge itself was holding its breath. We wandered around, shining our flashlights on the graffiti-covered beams and the crumbling edges of the bridge. Despite the stories, I didn't feel fear, just an uneasy curiosity. But that changed when we turned back toward the car. As we walked, we heard it. A low, rhythmic scraping sound coming from the riverbank to our left. It sounded like someone digging. We froze, our flashlights trembling as we aimed them toward the source of the noise. At first, all I saw was the riverbank, dark, damp earth and a few scattered rocks. But then, the beam of my flashlight caught movement. A figure crouched low, its back to us, clawing at the ground with frantic, jerky motions. The sound of dirt being tossed into the river made my stomach turn. "Is that a person?" Alex whispered, his voice tight with fear. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was too focused on the figure. It was pale, unnaturally so, and its body was thin, almost emaciated. The skin stretched tightly over its bony frame. Its shoulders moved rapidly as it dug, almost like it was vibrating. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I knew this wasn't just some late-night drifter or a desperate soul digging for something lost. This was something else, something wrong. I forced myself to aim the flashlight higher, the beam traveling up the creature's spine. The moment the light touched its head, it froze. Slowly, it lifted its face toward us. My breath caught in my throat. Its eyes were black, deep, hollow pits that seemed to swallow the light. The face was gaunt, the skin sunken around its cheekbones, and its mouth was a thin, barely visible slit. It stared at us, unblinking, as if trying to decide whether we were a threat or prey. Then it moved. It stood up in one swift motion, its limbs unfolding like a grotesque puppet. It was taller than I expected, at least 6 feet, and its fingers were too long, ending in sharp points that curled slightly. It took a step toward us, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it was trying to remember how to walk. "Run!" I managed to choke out. We didn't need to be told twice. Alex grabbed my hand and we sprinted for the car. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The cold air burned my lungs, but I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. I knew if I did, I'd see it right behind me. We reached the car, and Alex fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly that he dropped them. I snatched them up and unlocked the doors. We dove inside and slammed the locks down. For a moment, everything was silent except for our frantic breathing. Then I shined my flashlight on the windshield. There on the hood of the car were handprints, smudges in the dust with long claw-like fingers. Alex started the engine and we peeled out, the tires screeching as we sped away. I didn't look back until we were miles away, back on a well-lit road surrounded by houses and streetlights. Only then did I feel safe enough to breathe. We never went back to Blackwell Bridge. The stories we'd heard were no longer just stories. Something was out there, something ancient and hungry, digging in the dark and waiting for the next unlucky soul to wander too close. Even now, the memory of those black eyes haunts me. And sometimes on quiet nights, I swear I can still hear that scraping sound, a reminder that some places are cursed for a reason. Story 4. Something is stalking outside my house. At first, it was just strange noises and lights turning on by themselves. I told myself it was nothing, but as the nights wore on, I realized something was out there, and it was watching me. Place where people don't lock their doors during the day, where neighbors wave to each other and kids ride bikes until the sun sets. I never thought anything weird or dangerous could happen here. But over the last few months, that illusion has shattered. It started small, just little things I could brush off. The porch light would turn on in the middle of the night. At first, I thought it was my dad finally figuring out how to set the timer. He'd been messing with it for weeks, trying to get it to work automatically. But when I asked him about it one morning, he looked confused. "I gave up on that thing weeks ago," he said. "It's just a regular switch now." That didn't sit right with me. If it wasn't the timer and no one in my family turned it on, then who did? A few nights later, I was home alone, sitting in the basement playing video games. Our basement window looks out onto the backyard porch, and the light switch is right by the door. My dog, Luna, was with me. She's a relaxed dog, usually too lazy to care about anything going on around her. Suddenly, she perked up. Her ears shot forward, and she stared intently at the window. I glanced over, half expecting to see a raccoon or maybe a cat, but all I saw was darkness and the faint glare of the porch light reflecting on the glass. Then something moved. It was fast, just a white blur dropping down over the fence and darting past the window. I jumped up, my heart pounding. Luna let out a low growl, something I'd never heard her do before. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a big dog, but it didn't move like an animal. It was too fluid, too silent. I called a couple of my friends and told them what happened. They laughed it off, said it was probably a raccoon. Part of me wanted to believe them. I went outside with Luna, hoping to prove to myself that there was nothing there. The air was cold and the yard was still. Luna sniffed around, her tail stiff. My other dog, a chocolate lab named Bear, paced nervously, his nose twitching as he scanned the yard. I felt a tight knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. Something wasn't right. Then I heard it. A deep, low groan coming from the trees at the edge of our property. The sound was heavy, like the creaking of an old door, but it carried a weight that made my skin crawl. I shined my flashlight into the trees, but the beam was swallowed by the thick branches and leaves. I stayed outside longer than I should have, my fear battling with my curiosity. Luna seemed to be following something with her eyes, something I couldn't see. Bear stayed back, his body tense and his eyes wide. I finally gave up and went back inside. But that night I didn't sleep. I stayed in my room, listening. I heard small, almost imperceptible sounds, like pebbles hitting the window or footsteps on the roof. And then, just as I was drifting off, there was a loud slam outside. It sounded like a tree branch hitting the ground. But when I looked out the window, nothing had fallen. The yard was still, and the porch light was on again. The weeks that followed were worse. I'd catch glimpses of a white figure in my peripheral vision, something crouching low and moving unnaturally fast. One night, while FaceTiming with my sister in the basement, we both heard a screeching noise. My first thought was that our cats were fighting with a raccoon again, so I ran to the window to check. And that's when I saw it. A gaunt, white figure stood just beyond the porch, its back turned to the window. It was taller than me, with long, bony limbs and a hunched posture. The skin was pale and almost seemed to glow in the dark. It was facing away, but even from behind, I could sense something wrong. I froze. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. Then, in one sudden, jerky motion, the figure twisted its entire body to look at me. The movement was too fast, too unnatural, like a marionette being yanked by its strings. I heard a sickening crack, like bones snapping, as it turned. I didn't see its face. I didn't want to. I screamed and stumbled backward, barely managing to keep my balance. I ran to my room, slammed the door, and locked it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip my phone to call my sister. She thought I was losing it. Maybe I was. But when I finally worked up the courage to look outside again, the figure was gone. Since that night, the lights keep turning on and off, and I still hear those noises, the scratching, the footsteps. Some nights, Luna will stare at the window, growling softly, her body rigid with fear. I don't know what's out there. I don't know what it wants, but I know it's watching, waiting. And every night, when the lights flicker and the shadows move, I wonder if tonight is the night it finally decides to come inside. Story 5. Chased by the unknown at a golf course inside. It was supposed to be another night of harmless fun. Just two friends walking around the old golf course, killing time. But something out there decided we were on borrowed time. We were just a couple of teenagers, bored out of our minds. My best friend Danny and I spent most summer nights wandering around his neighborhood in Austin, Texas. We thought we were cool, 15 and 14, smoking cheap menthols we stole from our older brothers, talking about things that didn't matter. Near Danny's apartment complex was an old golf course, half abandoned and poorly maintained. It had become our regular haunt. The grass was overgrown in places, the sand traps were filled with weeds, and the water hazards had turned into stagnant pools. But it was our playground. We loved the eerie quiet of the place at night, the way the shadows of trees stretched across the paths like twisted fingers. That night, it was just past 7:30 p.m. The sun was setting, casting a deep orange glow across the sky. We were making our way along the trail, cigarettes dangling from our lips, feeling untouchable. We didn't care that it was getting dark. We'd walked this trail dozens of times. We stopped near a small pond, the surface reflecting the dying light. The air was humid, and mosquitoes buzzed around us. We joked and laughed, flicking cigarette butts into the water, feeling like kings of our tiny, forgotten world. Then I noticed something. A dark silhouette moving along the edge of the tree line. I squinted, trying to see it better. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a stray dog, but it was standing upright, and its movement was wrong. The figure took long, loping strides, covering more ground than it should have been able to. Its limbs swung too far, almost like they were out of joint. "Danny," I whispered, nudging him with my elbow. "Look over there." Danny turned and froze. His cigarette fell to the ground, forgotten. A second figure emerged behind the first, identical in every way. They were tall, unnaturally tall, with limbs that seemed stretched like distorted shadows. They walked in perfect unison, their movements eerily synchronized. The more I stared, the more I realized that they weren't walking toward the path. They were walking toward us. I felt a cold knot of fear twist in my stomach. "We need to go, now." We turned and started walking back toward the apartment, trying to stay calm, trying not to break into a full sprint. I kept glancing over my shoulder. The figures were still coming, but faster now. One of them had veered to the left, circling around the pond. The other one was coming straight through the water, its long legs moving with an inhuman fluidity. And they made no sound. No splashes, no footsteps. Just silent, relentless pursuit. "Run!" Danny yelled. We took off, the fear hitting me like a jolt of electricity. I wasn't a fast runner. I was chubby, out of shape, and terrified. Danny was slim and athletic, and he quickly pulled ahead. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were made of lead. I looked back. The figures were closer, too close. They glided over the ground effortlessly, their limbs swinging like pendulums, their movements horribly smooth. Danny must have realized I was falling behind because he stopped, turned, and grabbed the back of my denim vest, yanking me forward. I stumbled, but his grip kept me from falling. "Come on!" he shouted, his voice raw with panic. We ran harder. My heart was pounding so loudly I couldn't hear anything else. My vision blurred and sweat stung my eyes, but I didn't dare stop. We finally reached the edge of the golf course, where the trail opened up to the apartment complex's gym building. The door was unlocked. We barreled inside, slamming it shut behind us. I collapsed on the floor, gasping for air, my entire body shaking. Danny peeked out the window. His face was pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. "They're just standing there." I pulled myself up and looked out. The figures were at the edge of the trail, half hidden in the shadows of the trees. They were still, silent, watching. Their heads tilted slightly, as if they were considering whether to come closer. We stayed in that gym for what felt like hours. Too scared to move, too scared to speak. The room was dim, the only light coming from the street lamps outside. We kept expecting the figures to come up to the windows, to press their grotesque faces against the glass. But they never did. After what must have been half an hour, though it felt like an eternity, Danny whispered, "We have to get home." We forced ourselves to step outside. The night was quiet again, the path empty. The figures were gone, but I felt their absence like a hole in the world, a place where reality had frayed and something else had leaked through. We walked back to Danny's apartment, our eyes scanning every shadow, every tree. We locked the door behind us and didn't sleep that night. We just sat in the living room, jumpy and silent, the weight of what we'd seen pressing down on us. We never told anyone. Who would believe us? Two teenage boys claiming they'd been chased by silent, inhuman figures on an old golf course? We barely believed it ourselves. But every so often, when I pass that place, I feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I can't help but look into the trees, expecting to see those figures standing there, watching, waiting. And I know one thing for sure, whatever they were, they're still out there.